the feast of eternal joy. For from his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. And to know the love of Christ that surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled with all the fullness of God. The approach through the fullness of God, which dwells bodily in Jesus Christ, leads us beyond the traditional ideas about the self-glorifying will of God and the self-realizing nature of God, and makes the interplay of all blessing and praising, singing, dancing and rejoicing creatures in the community of God more comprehensible. In order to grasp the fullness of God, we have the freedom to leave moral and existential concepts behind, and to avail ourselves of aesthetic dimensions. The fullness of God is the joyful fullness of the divine life, a life that communicates itself with an inexhaustible creativity, an overflowing life that makes what is dead and withered live, a life from which everything that lives receives its vital energies and its taste for living, a source of life to which everything that has been made alive responds with deepest joy and ringing exaltation. The fullness of God is radiant light, light reflected in the thousand brilliant colors of created things. The glory of God expresses itself, not in self-glorying majesty, but in the prodigal communication of God's own fullness of life. The glory of God is not to be found, either, in his laborious self-realization by way of his self-emptying, but follows upon that on the eternal day of resurrection. The glory of God is the feast of eternal joy, and the Gospels therefore continually compare it with a wedding feast. Enter into the joyful feast of your Master. Jesus' friends are wedding guests, because they are people belonging to God's kingdom. Their final fulfillment is imagined in Revelation 19:7 as the marriage of the Lamb. Even the heavenly Jerusalem comes down from heaven to human beings like a bride adorned for her husband, according to Revelation 21:2. In Luke 2:10, the announcement of Christ's birth is proclaimed as news of a great joy. According to John, Jesus' joy will remain in those who are his, so that their joy may be full. For the coming of Christ is the arrival of God's kingdom, and the first human reaction to it is profound joy. The resurrection of Christ means the overcoming of death's power and the appearance of imperishable, eternal life. The first human reaction to this is the unrestrained jubilation of the risen Christ. Here the divine life opens and communicates itself. The Bible calls this charts. The divine life communicated is also eternal life, life in participation in the divine life. But it is not just life in the world beyond, life after death. It is an awakening, a rebirth, already here and now, and the endowment of earthly life with new vital energies. The charts communicates itself in countless spiritual gifts. These are not just gifts of grace. They are new living energies as well. We are interpreting charts too narrowly if we only relate grace in a legalistic way to indicted sinners. Charts is life drawn from the fullness of God, and it shows itself in new livingness and exuberant joy. The reaction to charts is chara, joy. It is this joy that is called true faith. For human beings who desire to live and have to die, everything draws to a point in death. If death is the end, then all delight in living is as transitory as earthly life itself. But if life comes from the fullness of God, then this life is divine life, and manifests itself in us in the resurrection life. Consequently, for Christian faith, the resurrection of Christ was from the very beginning the open plenitude of God, and the joy that is called faith was the risen Christ rejoicing. The day of resurrection, let us be light on this feast, and let us embrace one another. Let us speak to those who hate us. For the resurrection's sake we will forgive one another everything. And so let us cry, Christ is risen from the dead. Enjoy over the open fullness of God, out of which we receive not just grace upon grace but also, as we can now say, life upon life. The life we live here and now is already transfigured and becomes a festive life, life and celebration. The joy brings music and imagination into this life, so that it is not just lived but is also shaped and given an expression. Then life does not just go forth, it is set forth and molded by God and human beings. Lived life itself becomes a song of praise. Even in pain and fear, community with the crucified Christ brings into life sparks of trust and candles of hope. Do believers have this joy for themselves in a world hostile to them and to life? No, for them the transfiguration of life in the joy of the resurrected Jesus, which they experience, is no more than a small beginning of the transfiguration of the whole cosmos. The risen Christ does not come just to the dead, so as to raise them and communicate to them his eternal life. He draws all things into his future, so that they may become new and participate in the feast of God's eternal joy. Through thy resurrection, O Lord, the universe is illumined. The whole creation praises thee, day by day offering thee a hymn. Out of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, joy throws open cosmic and eschatological perspectives that reach forward to the redemption of the whole cosmos. A redemption for what? In the feast of eternal joy, all created beings and the whole community of God's creation are destined to sing their hymns and songs of praise. This should not be understood merely anthropomorphically. The hymns and praises of those who rejoice in the risen Christ are, as they themselves see it, no more than a feeble echo of the cosmic liturgy and the heavenly praise and the utter joy in existence of all other living things. The feast of eternal joy is prepared by the fullness of God and the rejoicing of all created being. If we could talk only about God's nature and his will, we should not do justice to his plenitude. Inappropriate though human analogy is bound to be, in thinking of the fullness of God we can best talk about the inexhaustibly rich fantasy of God, meaning by that his creative imagination. From that imagination life upon life proceeds in ever-changing abundance. If creation is transfigured and glorified, then creation is not just the free decision of God's will, nor is it an outcome of his self-realization. It is like a great song, or a splendid poem, or a wonderful dance of his fantasy, for the communication of his divine plenitude. The laughter of the universe is God's delight. It is the universal laughter of the resurrected Jesus.